Today's worship service, including the bulletin cover, is brought to you by musicals about God and theology from the 1970s. Day by Day from Godspell, right? Yeah, I got that right. And then the cover are Pharisees from Jesus Christ Superstar. So today's worship is all about those. The only one we don't have is Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, and that would fill out the trinity of those musicals. Will you join me in prayer? Holy God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable to you, for you are our rock and our Redeemer. So for the next few weeks, y'all, we are going to be working through a few stories in the Gospel of Luke in which Jesus encounters the Pharisees. The Pharisees were a group of observant and influential Jews that existed for about 200 years, about 2nd century BCE to the end of the 1st century AD, and then they just kind of fizzle out. The name Pharisees most likely means separate ones, but like with all things in antiquity, there are concerns if that's true or not. This term, separate ones, referred to their separation from the rest of Judaism because of their strict following and observance of piety and purity laws. It's also understood that the Pharisees, when interpreting the Torah, including books like Leviticus and Deuteronomy, where there are very strict purity laws, but those laws are laid out specifically for a specific class of priests. The Pharisees took those books and said, no, those laws apply to all. Which, let me be clear, the rules laid out in Leviticus were not written for all. They were written for the Levites, the priestly class. Y'all can't say it either. But the laws were not meant for all of Judaism. But hey, we did the same thing. When Christian fundamentalism appeared on the scene at the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries, hey, those laws in Leviticus and Deuteronomy, they applied to all of us once again. And now that is the most vocal view in Christianity. Now we must be careful to not paint all Jews from this time period as being Pharisees. That's not the case. This was a group within Judaism, not the entirety. Quite often when we read about the Pharisees in the Gospels, we think of them as antagonists or those who stand against Jesus. And for good reason, because that's what they do most of the time. However, in Luke's Gospel, Jesus seems to be taking a different approach in their interactions. One in which, instead of treating them with contempt, as portrayed in most of the other Gospels, Jesus seems to take an approach with them where he approaches them with pity. And next week we'll see this pity on full display. But it is because of this more gracious approach to the Pharisees that I chose Luke's Gospels for this sermon series. Because in our current situation as 21st century Americans, in our society, we can't keep treating people with contempt. And when Jesus himself offers a different way of doing something, I believe that we must look at it. The person that is being healed in this story, the man with the withered hand, should be at the center of this miracle story. He should be. He's the one receiving the miracle. But the healing and the one being healed does not take center stage here. It's the Pharisees who witness a miracle and can't see past their own legalisms. In those days, maladies like withered hands or leprosy were all linked to the sin of a person or to the sin of their parents. Back then, they didn't understand viruses and virality in the way that we do now. They didn't understand genetics or chromosomes and DNA. And so, like people of all places and all times, including us at this very place and this very time, they're trying to make sense of what scares them. So we must be careful not to look back on these less scientific times and laugh at their lack of understanding. For we too just experienced a pandemic in which we understood nothing about the virus and thoughts about how to control it ran wild. And our laughing, and most definitely mine, laughing at people who were grasping for hope and looking for answers, was not helping building any bridges. And need I remind us of the misunderstanding of how HIV and AIDS are spread? Still to this day, we have people who believe that it is a disease that is exclusive to the people who have sex with the same gender, and that HIV and AIDS are a punishment for living that lifestyle. We haven't come so far. But it was the same thought back then for the Pharisees. They saw things in black and white. Zero tolerance. There was no legal gray area. No room for empathy. And instead of condemning the Pharisees in this moment for their lack of empathy, Jesus just asks them a question. A question in which the gospel writer believes Jesus knew that the Pharisees were thinking. Now, I don't think Jesus knew what they were thinking because of his godly divinity. I think Jesus knew what they were thinking because of his humanity. Jesus asks, is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath? To save a life or destroy it? Now, no one answers. Because to answer that question would either make you out to be, at worst, pure evil, and at best, to your Pharisee peers, you'd be a heretic. So they don't answer it. And Jesus looks around, and I can imagine him raising his eyebrows saying, yeah, that's what I thought. And Jesus asks the man to reach out his hand, and the man does, and the man is healed right there on the Sabbath, seemingly breaking Sabbath law. In his letter from a Birmingham jail, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. wrote that an unjust law is no law at all. In this moment, Jesus is teaching by example what the law of love is. That regardless of what situation a person is in, and regardless of what situation we are in, and for this morning's scripture story, that particular scripture was the Sabbath day. Regardless of all of that, Jesus calls us to serve. Now, those Pharisees, they didn't help for two reasons. The first being Sabbath, so no, they're not going to do anything. Fair. Second, they believed it was the person's sin or even their parents' sin that brought upon their malady. The Pharisees believed because of that, it would be unlawful to help others because of their sin, causing them to sin. That was their belief. But Jesus flips this on their head in front of them, answering their questions by doing an action. His action of healing said, no, it is not unlawful to serve, but rather it is unlawful to not serve. Jesus' actions in this story teach us that it is more legalistic under the law of Jesus to love, regardless of what day of the week it is. It is more legalistic under the law of Jesus to love, regardless of what that person did or did not do to end up in that situation. It is more legalistic under the law of Jesus to love, regardless of what is said in ancient scriptures that even Jesus himself followed. You see, that's why Jesus came to this world. To open up our understanding of what it means to be children of God, not to close it off. Not for us to build up walls around ourselves, to isolate ourselves from the rest of the world. Not to separate us as the Pharisees' name would imply, The only time Jesus isolated himself and the disciples were so that they could go and get rest on retreat. And it was always temporary, and it was always interrupted because the world needed them. Y'all, if Jesus wanted us to be a closed-off movement, one where we didn't interact with the rest of the world, one where we would put ourselves over everyone else first, living behind a shroud of laws, Jesus would never have debated with the Pharisees. He would have told his disciples that they were right. Go and join their movement. Follow their laws, their rituals. The Pharisees that exist today, they're still here. And they're not Jews. Although there may be Pharisees that still follow these rules to this day. But they cling to the laws that even they disagree with. Because, hey, that's the law. The Pharisees that exist today, they cling to laws that aren't meant for us, both religious and governmental, whether it's appropriate for our time period or not. The Pharisees in our world want to isolate us from the rest of the world. The Pharisees that are in our world, they're other Christians who think that the world must adapt to their worldview, just like the Pharisees did. They are the other Christians who claim that they can't do something because of the law of God. And let me be clear, very clear, so that there's no question today. The Bible and Jesus explicitly name the Pharisees and use them as an example of what not to be. So let me be clear and join in this tradition. Today's Pharisees are Christian nationalists. Those who seek to make our country one nation under one God, under one understanding of faith. A national faith. A national faith where no matter who you are or what you believe, that the belief and faith of others will direct every aspect of our lives. When a national faith is the antithesis of why people fled and continue to flee to this country for centuries, and will continue to do it tomorrow. In certain states where Christian nationalists have a tight grip on the government, we see the ramifications already. Women being forced to carry pregnancies to term regardless of their situation. Because Christian nationalists see the law in black and white, not a gray area. They say that our nation is a nation of law and order, whether they agree with those laws or not. Claiming that we need a strong border in order to create a stronger understanding of the black and white of who is in and who is out. They tell us that we have to fit their mold, that we must stand with the same reverence for our anthem and songs that they do. There is no black and white there. They question people with gotcha questions, like the Pharisees did. What is a woman? Hoping to give someone just enough rope. And also, let me be clear, just as I said earlier, that we must be careful with painting all Jews from antiquity as Pharisees. We must do this with the Christian nationalists and the party in which they dwell, because not every Republican is a Christian nationalist. That's very true. The Pharisees were a group of Jews when Jesus was alive. And newsflash, y'all, Jesus was a Jew. He wasn't debating non-Jews. He was debating other Jews. This was a family conversation. Which is why we Christians, we have to talk about this in church. Because Christian nationalists, whether we like it or not, they're part of our family. Just in the same way that the Pharisees and Jesus were family through their faith. This is our problem that we must confront. This is our problem that we as a church must exist for. Because the LGBTQ plus community that the Christian nationalists rail against, they need a safe haven that is a church, not just a community center. Because women who have had abortions and men who have been a part of that process, they need a place at this table. Because undocumented migrants might not be fleeing to steal, but rather fleeing to live. Jesus knew that the Pharisees could not become the dominant Christian voice, the dominant Jewish voice of their time. He saw the ramifications of what that would look like. People being ignored because of laws. People having to suffer because of laws. People being ostracized by their faith leaders because of laws. Y'all, Christian nationalism cannot become the dominant Christian voice. Over the next few weeks, as I said, we will be walking through other Pharisee encounters in Luke. And I chose Luke for a reason. Because of the more gracious approach Jesus took to the Pharisees in Luke. Because as we will see in the coming weeks, Jesus will dine with the Pharisees and he will correct them with instruction, not condemnation. Because this is the example we need from Jesus in our time. Because here's the thing. From their point of view, we're Pharisees too. On our side, we get mad when people don't speak the right words at the right time. We condemn each other because we may not be lockstep on issues. Our gray area has become black and white. And y'all, I'm going to do something I don't ever do in sermons today. I've never done it before in a sermon, and I hope to never do it again. But I'm going to quote a politician. And it's not a political thing that he's talking about. He's talking about how we interact with each other. And that's why I'm going to quote him. This past week, Barack Obama, former president, was speaking to the Democratic National Convention as a Democrat. He was having a family conversation, just in the same way Jesus and the Pharisees were. But he said, to make progress on the things we care about, the things that really affect people's lives, we need to remember that we've all got our blind spots and contradictions and prejudices. And that if we want to win over those who aren't ready yet to support our candidates, we need to listen to their concerns and maybe learn something in the process. After all, if a parent or grandparent occasionally says something that makes us cringe, we don't automatically assume they're bad people. We recognize that the world is moving fast, that they need time and maybe a little encouragement to catch up. Our fellow citizens deserve the same grace we hope that they'll extend to us. Our fellow citizens deserve the same grace we hope that they'll extend to us. If progressives understand spectrums, all of the spectrums in which we know that exist in this world, and if we say that we understand them, we have to see modern-day Pharisees as a part of our spectrum. As much as it pains us, we can't keep being progressive Pharisees. We must follow Jesus' example. May it be so.